who decide to become an artist, who find it's their calling, have some germ, some moment at which it becomes clear to them what it is they must do with their life.
The nature of being human is to have an enchanted world.
He's got this weird integrity, I think. He's got this weird integrity that does come in a strange way from being always slightly out of step. And he is endlessly fertile.
The Theosophical movement was a large part of it. Spiritualism was a large part of it. This was part of the alternative spiritual background that was surrounding Spare at this time. And I think it fascinated him, and I think it provided a great deal of inspiration for him as an artist.
He's the ultimate British artist who is off the radar of British art, off the curriculum of art history that's taught in universities.
Spare's life was a life where he didn't get what he wanted. You know, his luck was dashed, you know, and he spent his creative life as productively as he could, despite the circumstances he was in.
The son of a working class police officer, City of London police officer, that starts the obituaries, that starts most of the news press articles, that doesn't really define him in the end.
Austin Osman Spare was born in 1886 and in his 69 years on this earth became one of the most talented, visionary and enigmatic figures in British art. When he died, he left behind a personal history rife with myth, confusion, inspiration, heartbreak, contradiction and mystery. Who was Austin Osman Spare? No two descriptions of any facet of the man's life are ever the same. There are as many interpretations of Spare as there are people who know him, either through his esoteric practices or through his art. Here, we aim not to reconcile or even elucidate. Rather, our wish is to celebrate Spare through just some of those myriad interpretations.
Spare was born in the shadow of Smithfield Meat Market towards the end of the 19th century. His father was a policeman and was stationed locally at Snow Hill. He was the fourth of 5 children. It was quite a difficult upbringing, I think, there, but his father had a regular income, so that was very supportive.
They were working class but very, very respectable. Spare wasn't allowed to play in the street with other children. And the Spare boys, when their father entered the room, the Spare boys all had to stand up. So there was a very disciplinarian kind of background and very, very, quite straight-laced, really. I think his relationship with his siblings was quite normal. It was he was fond of his father as well, although his father was very strict. But his relationship with his mother, for reasons we don't fully understand, wasn't good.
There was a lot of visual art in that area in terms of the facades of the buildings, the church that he went to, the mouldings, and I think as a receptive visual child he would have found resonance there. So that for me is the start of the artist, on the streets of, you know, the backyards, in this church schoolyard.
I think also the fact that he lived so close to Smithfield Meat Market. I think that sense of just seeing enormous quantities of dead animals gave him a sense of kind of mortality and flesh, as if we're all going to kind of go through the cosmic meat grinder in the end. I think he probably got quite a strong sense of that from being up against that on a daily basis around Smithfield.
Toward the end of Spare's life, a story was circulated about a Mrs. Patterson. She was, so the story goes, a local woman, a witch, and mentor to Spare in the ways of the esoteric.
The reports that have been circulated in the past about someone who looked after Spare in his youth goes by the name of Mrs. Patterson in many accounts. I have no doubt is based on some element of fact. We have reports of from his sister that there was somebody who was known to the family in the childhood who had powers of prophecy. So I have no doubt that part of the stories of Patterson are certainly based on actual events, yes.
There was a woman called Mrs. Patterson, certainly. She certainly existed. I've got her death certificate. She's a totally real person. She died at the age of 102. The question is whether she was a witch, and even whether Spare really knew her at all. And both of those we're not sure. I mean, I think she's not a witch, for one thing. Secondly, he may not even have known her. I think he got the name, probably Mrs. Patterson, from a newspaper report when it was her 100th birthday, and she got the telegram from the Queen or whatever.
Spare was not destined to spend long in Snow Hill. In 1894, his family moved south to Kennington.
I think for Spare, the most important event of his young childhood was the move to Kennington, because at that time the environs of Smithfield Meat Market were becoming quite industrial, and I think that when the family came into money, they decided to move to Kennington would be beneficial for everybody. So when the family moved there in 1894, Spare found himself in a completely different social and economic environment.
From a young age, Spare had been a talented artist, but now something else was entering his creative consciousness. With his early education at St Sepulchre's Church School, and now his inclusion in the Congregation of St Agnes, Kennington, Spare was learning the power of ritual and belief.
It's a very visual and tangible experience of being a choir boy or setting out the hymn books in a big church, seeing again all the decorations, smelling the incense, hearing the chant, hearing the hymns.
Just being around a kind of high church environment sometimes, I think, predisposes people to the occult later. But particularly, I would say, spiritualism. We're still coming to understand how important spiritualism was for Spare. I think spiritualism and theosophy are probably the two biggest influences on Spare, but spiritualism in particular.
Spiritualism obviously had been around for some time when Spare got involved, and I think that what we see in his artwork is in some ways influenced by spiritualism. So on the one hand, we have these ectoplasmic forms that seem to surround some of the figures that he's depicting. And the spiritualists, of course, were very interested in the material manifestations of the spirit world and documenting these. So I think there are a number of ways that Spare's work shows an influence from spiritualism, which was very much going on around him at the time.
It was this component that was to elevate his talent to a new level. Spare's work was to take on an esoteric theme, incorporating elements of his Edwardian religious upbringing and subverting them in line with his developing ideas. This was to be a cornerstone of his impending success.
I think Spare was quite introverted as a child, and one of the ways which his father felt would be beneficial towards getting him out into the world and to promoting him was to get his work seen by a larger number of people, and whether either Spare's father submitted him for an application for the summer exhibition or whether Spare was part of that, we don't know. But what we do know is that when he was accepted, it had an enormous impact on his life.
Two of Spare's designs were accepted into the 1904 Royal Academy Summer Show. For an artist to achieve this accolade at such a young age was truly remarkable, and the local press took a keen interest in the boy artist of Kennington. Spare was now to come into contact with the wider art world.
Prior to this point in time, Spare's interest in art and his kind of development, if you like, his kind of artistic development, had been very, very internal and had been very, very private. And suddenly after this point, almost overnight, the whole world was interested, seemingly.
When he had his moment of stardom at the Royal Academy with the bookplate design, and there were newspaper stories, boy genius, all that kind of thing, he seems to have been praised by quite a few famous artists, but it's quite hard to pin that praise down and actually find it. Various people, John Singer Sargent, Watts, various people are supposed to have told him he was a genius or said he was a genius. And I think that he probably mistook kind of kindness and encouragement for, as it were, absolute praise.
The early reviews of the exhibitions and of the books that he produces they're quite ambivalent. There's quite a mixed message there. He could give him a chance. Maybe next season he'll settle down and he won't be so volatile, and the drawings might be more palatable to a wider academic audience.
But Spare had other ideas. In 1905, aged 19, he published his first book, Earth Inferno.
I think the point of Earth Inferno is he's saying really daily life, everyday existence is hell. But also because of the kind of intellectual legacy of the 1890s, it's kind of implicit with him that he thinks that a very negative worldview is going to somehow go down well because of the 90s, when there's a enormous kind of atmosphere of pessimism and despair. And he's been kind of steeped in that without noticing it, rather like somebody in the 1960s being steeped in love and peace.
The 1900s art world continued to be receptive to Spare's strange and eclectic works. As his technique developed, so too did his output diversify. Alongside his ever-developing esoteric stylings, more conventional paintings and ex libris were produced on commission for his patrons. In 1907 he exhibited at the Bruton Gallery, where he came into contact with Aleister Crowley.
The vast sort of portion of Spare's early life, you know, from the first moment he could pick up a pencil and start drawing, right through his Royal Academy show, right up to the Bruton show in 1907, his work, his esoteric interest, and the way that manifests through his art had been a very internal process. And I don't think he'd really ever encountered somebody who could comment upon it.
I think the initial interest in Spare's work was because he was clearly a child prodigy and a master draftsman. I think that of a number of British artists, he really does stand out with his mastery of the line. He really was a superb draftsman, and that was what captured public attention at that time.
In terms of being able to make that connection with the esoteric component of what he was doing, there was really a lack of talent, if you like. And I think that when Spare met Crowley, he saw in somebody who was 10 years older than he, who seemed worldly wise and experienced, someone who perhaps finally could take an informed interest in what he was trying to do with his art.
I think what Crowley hoped to gain from knowing Spare was simply that he was after his body. And we know this because Crowley has annotated some of his poetry and explained that he was basically hoping to go to bed with Spare.
But these feelings were not to be reciprocated, for in 1909 Spare embarked upon the major romantic relationship of his life with a young woman named Ely Gertrude Shaw.
She was a chorus girl in the theatre. She'd already had a child, unmarried, which would have been quite a stigma and quite a burden in those days, and the child was being looked after by her mother. We're not sure how they met. One of the stories is that her mother met Spare in a pub and suggested that he might like to meet her daughter. She was obviously a fairly forward sort of woman to be in a pub at all in those days. Wouldn't be a very respectable thing for a woman to be hanging out in a pub. So the mother may have wanted to put Spare in touch with the daughter and get them fixed up, partly just to get her married off because she had a child. The child doesn't figure though in Spare's life really. The child continues to be looked after by the mother-in-law.
And I've no doubt that Spare probably saw it as a real catch. They courted for some while. They were married in 1911 and went to live in Golders Green. But I think that in the early days, the marriage was successful and happy, by all accounts.
He's enjoying that last moment of the Edwardian era, which they talk about in the history books as being the sunny afternoon of the British Empire. You know, the storm clouds will be rolling in soon. And luckily for Spare, you know, that was going to put the scuppers on his career as an artist.
At this point, in 1914, he was still very much a man with everything to prove. I think he felt that probably, you know, despite the successes he'd had, that he still needed to be integrated in some way with the establishment on his own terms.
His best years in terms of his career were already behind him. One of the strange things is his career was, in a sense, over almost as soon as it had begun. He's always already the man whose best days have gone. People are always referring back to him. You know, in the 1920s, they're saying, oh, we remember Spare before the First World War. But then even in sort of 1907, they're saying we remember Spare when he did his bookplate designs at the Royal Academy, and people are always saying that somehow the fire has gone, or time has not dealt kindly with Mr. Spare.
The onset of the First World War created a seismic shift in British society. The art world paled to insignificance against the backdrop of a continental Europe consumed with war. The world Spare knew was dying before his eyes.
He was helped by John Lane, his publisher at the time, and put on the reserve list, so he wouldn't be called up as soon as most of the young men, working population would be called up in the First World War. So his call-up was deferred until almost to the end of the First World War.
Being placed into that kind of confined environment is very daunting. Spare's enrolment form, which he signed, shows an incredibly shaky signature. Probably the shakiest signature I've ever seen of him, even in his later years. And my sentiment was that he was extremely nervous about the prospect of serving, without doubt.
Unlike some of the stories that he later told, for example, that he'd been the only survivor of a torpedoed troop ship, or that he'd spent all night in no man's land. I can't remember if he's on top of the pile of corpses or if he's lying underneath them. But anyway, in fact, of course, he never actually went to France during the war. He didn't see any action. To begin with, he was in the medical corps. He was doing things like inoculating people. And then he's recognised as an artist, so he's put on a project to illustrate the history of the war. And at one point, he's based in a studio down in Fulham Road. So he's employed as an artist during the First World War. And it's only after the war's actually finished that he goes over to France to do some work actually on site.
He was employed to use his beautiful gift in a way, to show just how awful the war could be.
He was deeply disturbed by the First World War and by the extent of the slaughter as well, the kind of carnage of it. Probably took him back to the world of the meat market, this death on a massive scale. I think he was disturbed.
Alienated by his exposure to the brutal reality of the devastated Western Front, Spare returned to England, where his marriage to Ely was now in its final stages of collapse.
She liked things like shopping, and she would have liked them to entertain more and to lead a more of a sort of social society sort of life. I think that's probably what she imagined she was getting when she married an artist. And of course, being Spare, it just didn't turn out like that.
After the First World War, when Spare was demobbed, there were very few options open to him. His life had changed. He'd lost his source of income. Many of the collectors that he'd known before the war weren't necessarily buying his work after the war. And I think that he had very few choices where he went and what he would do. I think that the prospect of finding a home again in South London, which was an environment which he'd grown up in, with which he had positive associations, must have been a very attractive option to him.
Spare first moved to Borough, residing in Beckett House for over 10 years. It was during this time that he published The Focus of Life and his final book, Anathema of Zos, a sermon to the hypocrites.
Anathema of Zos is generally perceived as his big disdainful disavowal of the hypocrisies of the age and his own sort of epic voice of the narrator, the artist narrator.
There is a sense with the Anathema of Zos in which he might be felt to be, as it were, burning his boats with the world he'd previously been part of. But I don't think it was greeted with kind of shock or horror. I think, by and large, much more nobody really noticed.
The first half of his life, really up until the early 30s, he'd spent it really trying to be accepted by the establishment on his own terms. And the realisation that this was never going to happen was actually really very liberating for him, because the moment he realised it was no longer necessary for him to try to do that, it gave him the freedom to do anything he really wanted to do.
A new phase of creativity beckoned. Spare turned to the natives of southeast London for his inspiration. He began painting his local types, ordinary people from his neighbourhood. For these he charged very little. He created numerous high-quality portraits of market traders, workmen, prostitutes and labourers.
He'd always been interested in character. In some ways there's a strong continuity to his life, because back in the moment of his first stardom, when the journalists came to interview him about his Royal Academy celebrity, one of the things he said was, what I really look for is character. He said, I saw a costermonger on the street this morning, had a terrific face. He says something like that. So there's always been this interest in character. And by the 30s, these are now the people he's moving among. So they're his obvious choice for models.
And we see Spare's style changing from those sort of intricate pencil drawings and the very intricate pen and inks from even earlier in his life to sort of fluid pencil lines with extraordinary sort of washes of colour, very reminiscent in some respects of his very early work with stained glass design.
He is really representing things which appear to leap from another world. But these are unusual spirits in the conventional sense of the term, because they aren't the typical human shapes or even animal shapes that we would expect to see. They are ugly, distorted, grotesque forms. And in that sense, this is a spirit world which is quite specific to Spare, I think, and is a part of his magical practice in working through his own psyche, his relatedness to the world around him, and dealing with all sorts of issues, including a post-war and then pre-war concern.
The pre-war concern took on a new significance for Spare when in 1936 he received a portrait request via the German embassy.
Hitler did, somewhat bizarrely, Hitler did try to commission a portrait from Spare. Hitler saw Spare's work through someone at the German embassy who had bought a Spare in London, and certainly, yes, Hitler did want a portrait from Spare in 1936, and Spare refused and became a bit of a hero in the local papers. But then, in 1938, Spare revives the story, and by now he's really confabulating. He says now that he did go to Germany, he did paint Hitler, and that he's going to use this work in some kind of magical anti-Hitler work. He's going to incorporate it into some kind of magical collage or something like that. So by now the story has just become fantastical. It's a kind of would-be publicity stunt.
Another war was coming. As Spare moved to Brixton producing new works for exhibition in his small flat, Europe was sliding towards a new abyss. When the war began, Spare was living on the Walworth Road in Elephant and Castle. He had abandoned the pretences of his old life and was now committed to his art and the business of day-to-day survival. The Spare of 1939, a world away from the young man of 1914.
By the time the Second World War came around, Spare's personal circumstances were very different. And I think he regarded that the community in which he lived, he was a part of that community. I think that fire watching, which is one of the duties he performed, was an important role that he could do, which would help protect the community in some way. And obviously he was past the prospect of active service, so that must have been a great relief for him.
In May 1941, on the heaviest night of the Blitz, Spare's flat at 56A Walworth Road was bombed.
Spare's studio was destroyed in the Blitz. He was fire watching at the time, but he lost an enormous amount of work. Particularly, he stacked up all his Cockney portraits, which he'd been developing over the years. So that was really quite a tragedy, not just for his career, but for really a kind of social document of South London as well. But this had a disastrous effect on him. He lost his memory, his hand, perhaps partly psychosomatic, but he found he couldn't draw. Really his life was wrecked for a while, and he kind of very painfully taught himself to draw again.
Spare recuperated in the home of Ada Payne on Wynn Road in Brixton. He returned to his art and began exhibiting in various South London pubs. Using the local press to promote his work, Spare re-established his reputation as an artist and now also as a survivor.
Ever since the 30s, in fact, Spare has got a sense now that he must be in newspapers to survive. I think it probably begins around the time of the Hitler portrait story. He develops a taste for publicity, and in career terms it's perfectly realistic. I think it is something he had to do. So although people often tell you Spare was a recluse, in fact, paradoxically, he was much more publicised and also much more self-publicised than really most artists, actually. All his pub shows became human interest stories in the local newspapers, that kind of thing. Spare really pioneered that with the pub shows. But he had to obviously pretend that this was really, really what he wanted to do. He says, well, I like to show in pubs because it's democratic and because it reaches the man in the street. And I think that's true. I don't want to knock that. But when he thought he was going to get a chance of another show in the West End, he says, no more bloody pubs for me. So you can see that he would have loved to get back to the West End, but he just never did in his lifetime.
The publicity around Spare would now lead to one of the most important partnerships and friendships of his life. In Kenneth and Steffi Grant, he was finally about to receive some of the attention and credit that he'd earned through years of obscurity and hardship.
Kenneth and Steffi first encountered Spare's work through Michael Houghton, who had a copy of The Book of Pleasure in his bookshop. And I can only imagine how much surprise Steffi must have had when she took out a popular magazine called The Leader and saw this article entitled Poor Painter with Cats, and saw Austin Spare sitting there in South London amid all his sort of feline friends. Because what had originally been a sort of historical individual, if you like, with this book published in 1913, suddenly this individual is right there as a living truth. And she wrote to him, care of the magazine, and eventually went to see him, and it was Steffi who introduced Kenneth to go and see Spare.
They strike up a very, very kind of warm friendship, and it's based on going regularly to the pub. They're always meeting in different pubs in South London and in the West End, and they exchange postcards. They can, because there are so many more postal services in a day, they can actually send postcards to and fro within one day and meet in pubs in the evening. So this becomes a big feature of Spare's life at this time now, drinking with the Grants.
The friendship between Spare and the Grants blossomed and continued into the 1950s. Taking inspiration from this, Spare continued to develop his occult and esoteric thinking, and was exhibiting his artwork in ever greater quantities. But it wasn't to last.
He neglected himself very badly. He was living just on tinned food, and really worse than that, living on just milk straight from the bottle. He stopped eating, and he always had bad health, and his appendix went. He got appendicitis. It turned to peritonitis.
I remember Dennis Bardens saying to me that he went to see Spare in hospital, and were very close to the end, and he said that he'd never seen in his eyes such sort of anger and fear. And I think Spare was probably very worried about what would happen, if it was going to be the end, whether his creative run had come to an end.
Austin Osman Spare died from his illness on the 15th of May 1956. He was 69 years old.
It was a pity because he was just, although he was physically quite shaky, he was kind of at full kind of creative power. And one of the things he said when it happened, he said, well, this is a stab in the back. So he sort of felt that just when things were starting to go well again, he'd been sort of cut down.
In his remarkable life, Austin Spare travelled from the bustle of Smithfield Market to the rarefied heights of the London art establishment, and then back into the beating heart of the working class metropolis. His various collisions with the crises of the 20th century left him bruised, but his talent and grim determination saw him through, along with the companionship of Ada Payne, Steffi Grant and others. Spare's work is one of the great hidden treasures of British art, and thanks to a small handful of custodians whose hard work has lifted him from obscurity, it is a treasure that may yet find a fitting home in the 21st century.